Citizenship on the Go. Lesson 2. American Government. Principles of American Democracy. Part 3. Foundational Rights and Amendments. The Founding Fathers who wrote the Constitution did not believe it should be unchangeable. For future Americans to exercise self-government, they needed to have a way to make additions and revisions to the law. The Constitution gives the two parts of Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives, the power to propose changes to the supreme law of the land. Changes or additions to the Constitution are called amendments. For an amendment to be made to the U.S. Constitution, Congress and a majority of state legislatures need to approve the proposed change.
In other words, in the United States, for a change to be made to the supreme law of the land, legislators must complete each step of the amendment process in order. The Constitution outlines more than one version of the amendment process, but the usual process follows these steps. First, a congressperson, either in the Senate or in the House of Representatives, must propose the change. Second, a majority of senators and representatives must vote to approve the change. Third, the legislative branches of a majority of the states of the United States must vote to approve the change. Civics Test Question: How are changes made to the U.S. Constitution? How are changes made to the U.S. Constitution? Amendments. The word amendment means change. Changes or additions to the U.S. Constitution are made through the amendment process. Following this process, someone in Congress proposes an amendment, all of Congress votes on the amendment, and then state legislatures vote on the amendment. If enough members of the legislative branch of the federal government and the legislative branches of state governments approve the amendment, the change is made to the Constitution. Civics Test Question: What are the two parts of the U.S. Congress? What are the two parts of the U.S. Congress? Senate and House. The U.S. legislative branch of government, Congress, has two parts, the Senate and the House of Representatives. Laws are written in both parts of Congress. For an amendment to be made to the supreme law of the land, the Constitution, a member of the Senate or of the House must first propose the amendment. Then both the Senate and the House must vote to approve the proposed change before it's passed on to state legislatures for their approval as well.
So far, 27 amendments have been made to the Constitution. The first 10 amendments were all made at the same time. We call these first 10 amendments the Bill of Rights. Since the Bill of Rights was added, another 17 changes have been made to the Constitution. One of these amendments repeals, or cancels out, an earlier amendment, showing that it's possible for changes to be made even to other changes to the Constitution.
Some constitutional amendments have to do with U.S. citizenship. For example, the 14th Amendment says that all persons born or naturalized in the United States, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are U.S. citizens. It's because of the 14th Amendment that most children born in the United States are automatically U.S. citizens, regardless of their parents' citizenship status. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution also says that no state government is allowed to deny citizens their constitutional rights as citizens, whether a person is a citizen from birth or by naturalization. Some constitutional amendments have to do with voting rights. Throughout the 1800s and the 1900s, people in the United States campaigned, protested, and petitioned Congress and state legislatures to add amendments to the Constitution to allow for more Americans to vote for government officials such as president, vice president, senators, and House representatives. 4 very important amendments about voting rights say that a male citizen of any race can vote, that women and men can vote, that you don't have to pay to vote, and that citizens 18 and older can vote. Amendments are also important tools for maintaining the constitutional system of checks and balances meant to keep one part of government from becoming too powerful. Certain amendments, such as the 22nd Amendment, were added to the supreme law of the land to set stricter limitations on high-level positions in government that might otherwise be used to accumulate total control. The 22nd Amendment says the U.S. President can only serve 2 terms at most. This rule about presidential term limits was added to the Constitution to prevent any person from being elected head of the executive branch over and over without end, and becoming too powerful in the process. Because of how difficult it is to complete the amendment process, in all the years since the Constitution was written in 1787, only 27 amendments have been added. The last constitutional amendment to be made so far was added in 1992. Civics Test Question: how many amendments does the U.S. Constitution have? How many amendments does the U.S. Constitution have? 27. So far, 27 amendments in total have been made to the U.S. Constitution. Civics Test Question: what amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are U.S. citizens? What amendment says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are U.S. citizens? The 14th Amendment. The 14th change made to the Constitution added the law that people born in the United States under U.S. jurisdiction are citizens from birth. The 14th Amendment also says that people who naturalize as U.S. citizens have many privileges that cannot be taken away by any state or local government. After naturalization, people who become U.S. citizens later in life have many of the same constitutional rights as citizens from birth. Several of the rights of U.S. citizens are listed in the 14th Amendment. Civics Test Question: there are 4 amendments to the U.S. Constitution about who can vote. Describe one of them. There are 4 amendments to the U.S. Constitution about who can vote. Describe one of them. Citizens 18 and older can vote. The most recent constitutional amendment about who can vote says that citizens 18 and older can vote. Other constitutional amendments about voting rights include the law that you don't have to pay a poll tax to vote, the law that any citizen can vote no matter their sex, which means that women and men can vote, and the law that a male citizen of any race can vote. Civics test question. The President of the United States can serve only 2 terms. Why? The President of the United States can serve only 2 terms. Why? The 22nd Amendment. Congress and a majority of state legislatures decided to add the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution in order to keep the president from becoming too powerful. The 22nd Amendment limits the President of the United States to a maximum of 2 terms in office. Preventing the same person from being elected president over and over again is a way of safeguarding against someone using their political connections and executive powers to take control of the entire government, becoming too powerful for the system of checks and balances to work.
When we discuss the Constitution, we are not only talking about the first few pages of the document that were written by the Founding Fathers in 1787. The 27 amendments that have been added by Congress and state legislatures in the more than 200 years that have passed since the Constitutional Convention are also part of the supreme law of the land. It is especially important for citizens and residents of the United States to know about the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. This section of the supreme law of the land contains many rules meant to protect people living in this country from having their basic rights taken away by the government.
While Federalists like Hamilton, Madison, and Jay were able to convince many Americans that the nation needed a strong central government, other foundational figures of U.S. history, like Thomas Jefferson and Patrick Henry, were concerned that this new strong government would wind up taking away individual freedoms and denying states the right to make any of their own decisions. Jefferson, who had written the Declaration of Independence years before, worried that the U.S. President and Congress would become just like the British King and his Parliament if the Constitution did not include any guarantees against that happening. To get the support of concerned critics like Jefferson for the Constitution, Madison and the other Federalists agreed to add a list of protected rights and freedoms to the supreme law of the land. Madison actually wrote the first draft of this list of 10 amendments. Because he played such a large role in crafting the Constitution and in convincing others to support it as a writer of the Federalist Papers, and because he drafted the first 10 amendments to be added to the Constitution, James Madison is sometimes known as the Father of the Constitution.
The first 10 amendments were all added at the same time, just a few years after the Constitutional Convention. Since these 10 amendments were about the rights of individual people in the United States, as well as the rights of state governments, we call these first 10 additions to the Constitution the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights states that the federal government is not allowed to stop people in the United States from exercising many basic freedoms Americans had been denied by the British government during the colonial period. It says that Congress is not allowed to make laws that take away the basic rights of Americans, and it protects Americans from being punished by the government for acting on their basic rights.
Civics test question. What does the Bill of Rights protect? What does the Bill of Rights protect? Rights of Americans. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution were added to protect the basic rights of Americans. These amendments were created to protect the rights of not only citizens of the United States, but of anyone living in this country. Because these amendments protect the rights of people living in the United States, they are collectively known as the Bill of Rights. Civics test question. James Madison is famous for many things. Name one. James Madison is famous for many things. Name one. One of the writers of the Federalist Papers. Madison, like Hamilton and Jay, was a firm Federalist who believed the U.S. needed a strong central government. He supported the passage of the U.S. Constitution by writing many of the Federalist Papers. Madison also made many contributions to the Constitution itself, not least drafting the Bill of Rights. For this reason, he's sometimes called the Father of the Constitution. Later, Madison was elected the 4th President of the United States. He served as president during the War of 1812.
The First Amendment, on its own, contains many of the basic rights Americans count on having in order to freely participate in their democracy. The First Amendment promises Americans freedom of speech and freedom of expression, which means that it is illegal for the government of the United States to punish Americans simply for saying, for writing, or for otherwise showing what they think, even if people in U.S. government don't like someone's opinion. Freedom of religion and freedom of worship are also promised to Americans by the First Amendment. Having freedom of religion means that you are protected from being punished by the government for choosing to follow whatever religion you want, or for choosing not to follow any religion at all. Freedom of worship is similar. Another First Amendment right is freedom of assembly. Having freedom of assembly means that the government cannot legally punish people for gathering together in a public space. Many protesters throughout U.S. history have exercised their First Amendment right to freedom of assembly to organize marches, sit-ins, and other peaceful demonstrations.
The First Amendment to the Constitution also promises Americans freedom of the press, or news media, and the freedom to petition the government. According to the Constitution, the government is not allowed to block the American people from voicing their complaints and requests for change. Americans have the First Amendment right to call or write to their representatives in government, to submit petitions, and to peacefully protest for change. These freedoms, along with others listed in the Bill of Rights, such as the Second Amendment right to bear arms, are the constitutional rights of everyone living in the United States. Civics test question. What are 3 rights of everyone living in the United States? What are 3 rights of everyone living in the United States? Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly. The First Amendment to the Constitution promises Americans freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly. It also more broadly protects the rights of people living in the United States to freedom of expression and to freedom to petition the government. It is not legal for the U.S. government to punish anyone for exercising their First Amendment rights. There are 10 amendments in the Bill of Rights, and all of them protect the rights of people living in the United States. For example, the Second Amendment protects the right of people living in the United States to bear arms. In other words, people in the United States have the right to own and carry weapons, such as guns. Like First Amendment rights to freedom of speech, religion, assembly, expression, and petitioning the government, the Bill of Rights protects the right to bear arms for people living in the United States.
When the 13 original colonies voted to ratify the Constitution, they were agreeing to the principle of rule of law. The rule of law is the idea that the law applies equally to everyone. Everyone must follow the law, no matter how rich they are or who their family is. Leaders must obey the law, even if they occupy positions of great influence and power. The government must obey the law, just like people with non-government jobs. No one is above the law, not even the president, state governors, or members of Congress. John Adams, who was elected the second president of the United States after George Washington retired from politics, summarized his support for the rule of law by saying that the United States needed to have a government of laws and not of men if it was going to succeed as a country. For people to have equal rights and for individual freedoms to be protected, the law must apply equally to everyone. Civics test question. What is the rule of law? What is the rule of law? No one is above the law. The rule of law means everyone must follow the law, leaders must obey the law, the government must obey the law, no one is above the law. The principle of rule of law, the protections promised by the Bill of Rights, and other safeguards for basic freedoms of Americans included in the Constitution opened the way for we, the people, to participate in U.S. government and society in many different ways.
There are many examples of civic participation available to Americans according to the nation's Constitution and other laws.
U.S. citizens, for instance, choose the U.S. President, the U.S. Vice President, members of Congress, and members of state and local governments by voting. Americans can help determine who makes it into government and what new laws are made in this country by joining a political party, such as the Republican or the Democratic Party, by helping with a campaign, or by joining a civic group or a community group.
The First Amendment to the Constitution promises people in the United States freedom of speech and freedom to petition the government, so you have the right to forms of civic participation, such as giving an elected official your opinion on an issue, contacting elected officials like senators and House representatives, or publicly supporting or opposing an issue or policy. American citizens also have the right to run for office in order to become a part of the government themselves and participate in government more directly.
Everyone in this country also has the right to write to a newspaper, which is one way to share your opinion and possibly convince others to support your idea of what the government should do about a problem.
Civics test question. What are two examples of civic participation in the United States? What are two examples of civic participation in the United States? Vote and run for office. Only U.S. citizens can vote in federal elections or run for federal office, but there are many ways anyone living in the United States can participate in their democracy. Some other examples of civic participation in the United States include joining a political party, helping with a campaign, joining a civic group, joining a community group, giving an elected official your opinion on an issue, contacting elected officials, for example, by calling senators and representatives in Congress or in the state legislatures, publicly supporting or opposing an issue or policy, and writing to a newspaper. This is the end of Lesson 2 of Citizenship on the Go.